Today, we are talking about when divorce happens. And I don't know about you, but in midlife, things happen. And I have a lot of people in my orbit right now who are navigating divorce and who are navigating really hard circumstances. And so we really wanted to bring this conversation to the podcast, knowing that this is the reality for many people. And whether you choose it or you don't choose it, it is hard and it is a ripping that happens. And so we're going to talk about that today. And we invited Tracie Miles to come on. She is the best-selling author of 7 books. She is the director of Compel Pro Writers Training at Proverbs 31 Ministries. And she is the founder of the Living Unbroken Divorce Recovery Program. Her latest book is God's Got You, Embracing New Beginnings with Courage and Confidence. And that was born out of her own story, which we're going to talk about today. She has three grown children, a son and daughter-in-law, and lives in Charlotte, North Carolina. Tracie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So you talk about this Lifequake that happened in your own story. Can you just begin there? Tell us what happened.
I can begin there. Well, obviously, since we're talking about divorce today, that is part of my story. That is the biggest life quake that I've ever had to experience. And God just kind of brought that term to mind because it felt like an earthquake. You know, it just come and it just shakes up your whole life and things fall through the cracks and things disappear and everything's destroyed and you just don't know how you're going to move forward. And so just that the term life quake just seemed very appropriate at the time. And, you know, I've had a lot of other things that have happened in life that just kind of turn your life upside down and send things in a direction that you didn't expect it to. But I also, the more I researched and the more I started writing about this book, was we have a lot of life quakes. Some are tragic and upsetting and feel like an earthquake, and the others are just life has changed and we're in new seasons and God's, you know, kind of ushering us into a new phase of life or a new beginning. And so there's 2 different ways that we can look at it, but I would say that the divorce life quake is kind of what catapulted my change of perspective over the last few years about how to embrace new beginnings and deal with the things that life has brought.
Can you talk a little bit about what you thought your story would be and then what ended up happening?
Well, I thought it would be just like everybody does when they're standing at the altar. You know, you're getting married and you plan on having kids and a career. I had graduated from college and we had built a small home. A few years later, we built a little bit bigger home and just pursuing our careers, had 3 children. And my husband he had several issues that he was dealing with for many years. And eventually those grew and grew to a point of, got to the point of being an enabler of things that were unforgivable that I kept forgiving. And so, you know, there comes a time when I feel like God just says, you know, it's time. It's time for you to take control of your life and not to be an enabler and not to forgive, of course, but you don't have to keep accepting the things that are, you know, should not be happening. And so there really came a point in the Living Unbroken book where I originally wrote a whole book just about divorce for women who are trying to recover from that. I really felt like God came to the point to where he just released me, you know, because we all feel like, okay, God's against divorce. God hates people who are divorced, but that's not what the Bible says. He hates divorce because of what it does to his people. And so it took me a while to come to that kind of revelation and that understanding and just be able to move forward from that.
Can we go back to the enabling and about what did that look like? And how did you eventually come to the realization that that's what you were doing?
Well, there had been, I certainly don't want to be slanderous at all. That's never my goal. My goal is to tell, you know, kind of what God did in my life through all of those things. But there was a lot of infidelity. There was a lot
Mhm.
of betrayal, a lot of lies, a lot of living that I didn't know was happening. And I sort of knew all these things. I could see the repercussions of them. I saw all the red flags, but I always wanted to think the best. And so I always thought, okay, I'm going to pray for my marriage. I'm going to pray for God to fix this. I'm going to pray for God to fix him or fix me or fix us or what
Mhm.
have you. And I'm going to forgive this situation. I'm going to forgive it again. I'm going to forgive it again. But, it gets to a point to where you have to really start thinking about, what do I want my future to look like? And what do I want my happiness to be like? And what kind of environment do I want my children to live in? And it was just through a lot of prayers and a lot of Bible study and a lot of support from Christian friends and just my church. And I just realized that it was time. There was one final blow, and the final blow was the
Mhm.
final blow. And
Mhm.
that was the day I said, okay, this is the final blow, as scary and terrifying
Mhm.
as it is. And that is the day that the earthquake hit my life. But I'm like, I'm done with
Mhm.
putting up with behavior that, I deserve better. And I think there's
Mhm.
so many women that are in those shoes that they accept because they think, I got to hold my family together. I've got
Mhm.
to look like I have this Christian, marriage, and I've got to follow what the Bible says. But the Bible doesn't say that you have to continue living in an abusive or that type of environment. And we all deserve the best that he has for us.
Mhm. Yeah, I would think that you have heard a lot of women's stories as you've been writing and speaking about divorce and with your recovery program. And for many Christian women, not all, because it sounds like your church was supportive of you. For many Christian women, I have heard that they get the message from their church community, you need to stay. It is your job to stay. Can you speak to that specifically and maybe how you came to understand that God said you need to take care of yourself and your kids too?
Hmm. Well, I'm certainly not a theology expert, so I don't want anyone
Mm-hmm.
to think that I am. But I did do a lot of research on, and I have had a lot of women that have told me that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my church said, I have to stay with this. I have to put up with this. That we made a vow, we made a covenant, and I am 100% for covenants. And we made that covenant before God to love and respect each other. And that's not always the case of what is happening. But I also understand and learned that what I said earlier is that God does not hate you if you get divorced. And sometimes that is God's path for you. And if that's the path that happens, whether you wanted it to happen, whether it was a mistake you made yourself that somehow resulted in that, God loves you the same. And he still carves out a beautiful path for you, and you can still have a wonderful future. It's a hard time and it's a hard season, and it may not be how you wanted your life to turn out to be, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean God loves you and doesn't have a great plan for you regardless.
So, one of the things that I hear a lot from my friends that are experiencing divorce is about financial stress and about how that fear of being kind of on the brink of disaster financially has prevented them from moving forward. How did you deal with that fear?
Well, that was certainly one of the reasons for my enabling, I'll be
Mm-hmm.
honest, because I
Mm-hmm.
had 3 kids, and 2 of them were in college, and then one I still had in high school. He was a sophomore in high school. And so I had been writing, I was doing a speaking circuit, but it certainly wasn't, a full time income. I did some corporate training, and that was kind of freelance. And so we were dependent on the, 2 income household. And so that's one of the reasons. And we had a good lifestyle. But
Mm-hmm.
it got to the point to where, although that was terrifying, it would, it made me happier to have to face my fears than to have to live in the environment that I was living in. And so, due to some of the things that my ex husband had gotten involved in, which ended up being in the millions of dollars that I wasn't aware of, that were all pinned to my name that I found out later on down the road, that just compounded the financial stress. And my house actually was going into foreclosure because he walked away from not only myself and our children, but just all finances. So it was scrambling. And so it was probably, not to scare anyone that's thinking about this, because everybody has a different story, but it probably was one of the hardest year or two of my life. But what I realized was the stronger that I had to be, the more strength that God gave me. And he did so many miracles in my life just from a provision perspective. I used to think God doesn't send checks in the mail. God doesn't make miracles like that happen for me. And, this can't happen. So many miracles happened and fell into place. And I can't even believe when I look back on it, how I even dug myself out of that hole. But it was just one step and one grasp at a time. And I think that's what women need to realize is, yes, it's terrifying, but your happiness and your joy is being held hostage by someone else if you're not meant to stay in that relationship. And so if we let finances be our only reason for staying, then that's going to really have an impact on both of those. Now, I know when children are smaller, it seems a little scarier because they're little. They've got a lot longer to go. But I had 2 college tuitions. I had another 4 or 5 year college tuition coming up, plus all of our regular bills. But I was able to, keep working. I ended up getting a job, which was just a whole nother miracle story that we don't have time for. And God has just provided in so many ways. So I think it's so important for women to realize that, God sees them. He hears their prayers. Maybe their marriage isn't working out the way they wanted to, but that doesn't mean he's forgotten them. And it doesn't mean he doesn't have a plan. Like I said, it doesn't mean that he can't provide for them. And he will. And I've seen that. I'm not a millionaire by any means, but I am not where I used to be. And that's what we need to keep our sights on is, a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, where do I want to be? And God's going to help us get there.
Yeah, it sounds like the overwhelm can come when you look at the whole big picture. Like the next 15 years, I don't know how I'm going to be able to handle the next until my kids are out of the house idea. I think most women think I can support myself, but when I have kids that I'm working around and their needs and maybe childcare, even if their kids are so little that they need to provide childcare on top of working. But that the breakdown of, okay, God, I'm going to look at not the next 15 years. I'm going to look at the next week. What can I do this next week? Is that the kind of breakdown that helps women get the perspective to say, I don't know how you're going to provide for me a year from now, but I'm going to work with you on this week. And then we'll talk about next week in a week. Is that the kind of breakdown that women you've seen use when they talk to God that is helpful?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And then sometimes, like in my case, I didn't really just sit around for months and months and months and months and think, hey, can I do this? Try to make plans. It's like, okay, this is happening. This is now reality. And so I have to figure this out. And so it certainly didn't happen overnight. And I spent many, 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 way too many than I want to admit, months. Just, I couldn't stop crying. I kind of cut myself off from the world. I was getting very depressed, all the things that you go through when your whole entire life changes and when the person that you loved is still living, but they're just not with you. So you're kind of mourning the loss of someone that's still living, but they're living another life with someone else. And you have to deal with all of those things. But each day is a stepping stone. And then there will come a day, and this day did come for me, where I finally was like, okay, I'm tired of being tired and sad and miserable and hopeless and thinking me and my kids are going to be out on a street corner. And, that didn't happen. Thank goodness. We did run out of gas one time on the side of the road going to church, mind you. I'm like, I am going to church, by gosh. But we ended up running out of gas. My mom came and she helped us. And so there's all these things that little things are going to happen that are not going to be good and that are going to be hard. But then when you look back on them, you think, look what God did. out of all
Mhm.
of that and where he has me today. And every woman is capable. Some have it easier than others, some have it harder than others, but his provision and him seeing us and our problems and his ability and capability to get us through and to kind of take us to that other side, even if we can't see what the other side looks like, it never fails.
Mhm.
So, one of the things I hear a lot from my friends experiencing divorce is about the ripping. They literally talk about the ripping that occurs in relationships. So, it starts with the family, and then it kind of moves out from there to the outer perimeter. And there's this tearing of your life as you've known it, but the relationships as you've known it too. So, what did that
Mm-hmm.
look like for you?
Fortunately, I mean, my children, like I mentioned, were older and we were very close, had always been very close. So they were kind of my biggest cheerleaders. Unfortunately, I probably leaned on them a little too much, but
Mhm.
they're a lot stronger now, I guess, as a result. So that for me didn't happen. I know so many women I hear from, especially when the kids are younger, or maybe they're even older than mine, depending on the family dynamics. It can be different in every single family, and it's so hard to deal with if you feel like your children are taking the spouse's side, and that's not fair. And, or like I lost a lot of friends during that time that I'd been friends with for many years, not because they didn't care about me, but because they didn't know how to handle the situation. I had people from
Mhm.
church kind of back off, not because they didn't care, they weren't loving Christian people, but because there wasn't a place for me. There wasn't a place for divorced or separated women in the church. And and that's really, really hard to deal with. But I just kind of started putting myself in different situations when I finally got to that point where, okay, I'm going to pick myself up off the floor and stop this, And that's kind of where, like, my first, just to backtrack a little bit, if I may, the very first book that I wrote after the divorce happened, I was already under this 2-book contract. And so I wrote this whole book. I'm like, I'm going to do this. I don't care what's going on in my life. Wrote this whole book. Well, that book will never be seen, that whole entire book,
Mhm.
because that wasn't the book that, God called me to write. What he did call me to do is change your mind. And so I ended
Mm.
up thinking, I mean, studying about how can I change? How can I change my mind? What does that verse
Mm.
mean that says capture your thoughts and give them all to the
Mhm.
Lord? What does that even mean? How do I do that? But once I started really grasping that concept and studying that and realizing that I need to start recognizing all the negative thoughts that I was having, because that was just keeping me down in the dumps every single day. Everything was just, terrible. And I could find no blessings, even though they were all around me. Recognizing those, refusing to think that way anymore, and then just rephrasing what I was thinking. Like, oh, why did this happen to me? Well, why didn't it happen to me? It happens to everyone. Or, we could think of anything. Why did I gain so much weight? Or why did I lose so much weight? Well, because blah, blah, blah. And we can turn it around into a positive. That's not the best example. But there are a lot of things that if we start thinking about how we're thinking, that could be standing in the way of us being able to move forward. So once we can kind of
Mm.
capture that and shift, I did a lot of research on brains on writing that
Mhm.
book, which sounds real
Mhm.
interesting, doesn't it? But it was just amazing to me how the physiological matter of our brains completely changes when
Mhm.
we change and become more of an optimistic thinker than waking up every day thinking the worst. And so that was very eye opening for me. And then I'm like, okay, well, I want to love my life again. So I started shifting and writing about how do I love my life again? And I
Mm.
started getting involved in more social activities, which was way outside of my comfort zone,
Mm.
and playing golf and playing tennis and just being more involved with friends and stop cutting myself off from everyone and being more open. And
Mm.
then I wrote the book on living unbroken, because by that time I was like, okay, God has helped me heal from this, and he's
Mhm.
kind of helped me rebuild my life, and I want other women to know it's possible for them. And then God's Got You, which is what we're talking about today primarily, which is why that
Mhm.
you had me on here, is really talking about embracing our new beginnings. Okay, change your
Mhm.
mind. Love the life God has given you, even if it's not the life that you had planned on. Let God heal your heart from the inside out. And now just embrace wherever you are and
Mhm.
start doing those things that you want to do, whatever that dream is. Maybe it's change a career. Maybe it's, do something crazy. Maybe it's write a book, or there could be so many things. Start a podcast, just go work in your church, start a ministry, whatever it is that you feel like you want to do, embracing a new season. I actually have 2 baby grandchildren on the way. Okay, now, first of all, I'm not old enough for that.
Yeah.
Pretty sure. But that's going to be a sort of a life quake but it's a good one. It's going to be a new beginning for my family, for me. And so there's going to be a lot of things to navigate with all of that, and with all of the ripple effect of the families, that did occur. So I'm already having to sift through that a little bit. But just being able to move forward and knowing that you can move forward, I think, is the most important thing that every woman going through this needs to remember. You can do it. God's got you. You've got this. And I did try to give a lot of encouragement, but also strategies and goals. How do you set goals for yourself? Stop dreaming and wishing something would be different and start making it different. And so that's really where my heart is today, is just, girl, get up and do it. And stop wishing that it would be different, because we are in charge of our lives, our destinies. God is, of course, but we have to take action for him to be able to do things in our life.
What if you are ready to move forward, but maybe your children aren't? So I'm just giving examples from like people that I'm walking with in different ways, but where maybe something happened and the woman's like, nope, no more, I'm done, and moves forward with the divorce and is feeling like, no, I'm moving forward. But then the children, more adult children or young adult children, are like, we still want the family together. Can't you reconsider? Can't, blow in? And almost, even though maybe I'm just saying the wife, because in this situation the wife was the one that was wronged and is like, no more. But then the kids almost want her to forgive because they want the family intact again, and they're pulling for that, and they're not ready to move on. So can you speak a little bit to that dynamic? Because that has occurred in several situations that I've heard of recently.
Yeah. I don't know that I'm fully qualified to answer that question as not being a marriage therapist or a child therapist. So that's a really hard situation, but I do think we need to remember that our children are going to go on to live their own lives, no matter how old they are, they're going to go on and live their own lives. And we have to do the same. You have to love them and respect them and ask them to respect your decisions. I mean, that's the only thing I could think. My children certainly weren't like, oh, okay, great, sure, I get it, because they didn't even know all the details. They didn't know, I didn't even want to share with them all the details because it would be hurtful for them. So even if they didn't understand it, they had to understand that that's what was best for me and what I felt like God was telling me to do and what I felt like would be best for the future overall.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of women, that's really hard, right? To say to their kids, this is something you want, but I am doing this for me, because we've been programmed to not be selfish. I say that with air quotes, that we are to live this sacrificial life. And yet we're balancing that with, if someone is being disrespectful to us, God doesn't call that living our best life. And so it is that tension, I think, that a lot of women, especially Christian women, walk in of, at what point there is a tipping point. And I liked your phrase of the final blow. Like, you knew, okay, this line has been crossed and we're not going back. I can't jump back over that line. And so for our listeners, if you know that line has been crossed, we want you to hear that God doesn't want you to just keep going back if you don't feel called to that. And I also want to speak to the woman who feels called to go back and to try again, that is an option, and redemption can happen in some marriages. We're not saying that's never possible. And at the same time, we are talking about respecting each person's decision of knowing what is best for their own journey. And that's what you're saying with your kids.
Well, I was so secretive about everything that I knew was going on for many years,
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of it did catch my children off guard. So I think I've learned that there's a fine balance between, you don't want to tell your kids everything and you have to know what's age appropriate. However, sometimes they might need to know something is
Mm-hmm.
happening before that final blow comes, because it is very shocking. But the more that I explained to my children what happened, and the more that they could see that this makes me sad, this is not something I'm taking lightly. This is
Mm-hmm.
not just a self-centered decision that I'm making. This is breaking me in two to
Mhm.
have to make this decision. But I believe it's best for me, my future, and your future.
Mm-hmm.
And, just really pray for God to open their hearts and help them start seeing things from both perspectives, because they're kids, and my parents were divorced. So I've been on the flip side of that. I completely understand that side as well. But once you kind of realize that, okay, I don't want mom to be sad, or I don't want dad to be sad. And I understand that I don't like this, but maybe this is best, and I just have to trust them and respect them and their decisions, then just continuing to ask God to help them adopt that perspective could be a game changer.
Mm-hmm. How can we, as the people around someone going through this, not be the people you described at church who maybe said there isn't a place for a single woman or a divorced woman in our group? So let's say in a social group, for example, and you're couples, and all of the sudden a couple in your group is going through a divorce. How do you support people in that process and not further isolate somebody?
Yeah. Well, I think what you said just then is the thing not to do. Let's start with what not to
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to isolate that person, because even some of the best friends that I had, basically it was not intentional, hateful
Mm-hmm.
isolation. It was, I don't know how to deal with this. I don't
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to do for them. I don't know what to say. I don't know if they want to talk about it. Just call them. Have a cup of coffee. Talk about the weather. How are the kids doing? Let's go for a movie. And you don't have to, it doesn't have to be all couples events, which I did do for a while, until it got to be where, okay, I'm tired of being the only single person. So that's kind of when I started stepping outside of my comfort zone and going to just some social meeting events. And I'm pretty much an introvert for the most part, believe it or not. And so that was not my comfort zone, but I was going to all these like singles events, like dinners and just different things that were going on in my town, just to be out of the house, just to force myself to meet other people. And but it also goes both ways. I also cut a lot of people off, like even some of
Mm-hmm.
my own family. Like, I don't want to tell you all the details. I don't want to cry anymore. I don't want to talk about it. And I don't think that's a good idea either. So we have to be willing to be transparent and open, and let the people who love us, and then not cut off the people that are going through it, but because you don't know what to say. Because if there's
Mm-hmm.
one thing that you need when you're going through this, is not to be lonely. And loneliness is crippling, because you've gone from having, especially if you're an empty nester, like shortly after that happened to me, my youngest son, 2 years later, went off to college. And so I come home, and here I am in this huge house, not only an empty nester, but I'm an empty nester all alone. And that was a
Mm-hmm.
really just kind of a mind blowing experience. Okay, what am I going to do with my life? Because
Mm-hmm.
here I am in this new phase of life, which I should be traveling and doing all these things. What you think about when you get to that stage, but that wasn't the case. So it's so important to really love on people that are going through separation and divorce in the same way that you would even if they weren't going through that, because what you really need more is just friendship, and to know that people see you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the loneliness is so big and so real. It's actually the one thing that I've been hearing with one friend in particular right now, is just, she's like, it's so lonely. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
so lonely. Because even though she has people around her, She also doesn't have people who understand her own experience. And no one really can, because our experience is ours. But what has been the most helpful for you? And I assume your group is one of those places for people, but where they can actually be with people who maybe understand on a different level.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the reasons I wrote Living Unbroken, the book, is because it can help people. Like, I would encourage women who have an incredible marriage to go read that book, because they, just like you're saying, you're going to know someone that is not quite as fortunate at the time, and you don't know what you can't possibly understand what they're going through. You cannot put yourself in their shoes for real. You can empathize and have compassion, but you can't understand just the stomach ache of fear and heartache, that they're experiencing, and all of the things that they're worried about. So just being able to, the book kind of helps you put yourself in that person's shoes so that you can talk to them and you can support them.
Yeah.
Forgot your question.
Yeah. What about the shame that often comes with divorce? And a lot of times that's in our own heads. I mean, it gets back to what you were saying about your thought life and why that's so important. But that's also a little bit inevitable, that we're going to feel shame around some of these things that come, even if we didn't choose them. So how did you navigate that?
That's a really hard emotion to deal with. It's kind of, you feel like you got the scarlet letter on your chest. Everyone sees that. But I think it's just a matter of praying and asking God to help you not feel ashamed. I mean, all of these seem like cliche answers, I guess, but we just need to remember who we are in Christ. And just because someone else didn't see our value doesn't mean we don't have value. If someone else made mistakes, we can wish that they didn't, but we don't have to be ashamed, because that's their choices and not our own. And there were things my ex-husband went around and told people that weren't even true. And then that made me feel ashamed. I'm like, I can't even take up for myself. That didn't even happen. That's not even accurate. So that makes you mad. So then you're on a whole different level of emotion, because now you're just kind of all the things. But just remembering who we are in Christ and not letting that shame make you feel like you're any less of a person than you were before or in God's eyes, and that you still can't do great things and be a great mom and a great sister and a great, daughter, and just all the things, all the people that are involved in your life.
You mentioned the grandbabies coming and the ripple effect that divorce has had on just things like, okay, now we're going to maybe be at the hospital together, or weddings, family weddings. And how do you talk to women who are facing life moments, and often with their kids, where, because you share children, you will always somewhat be connected? How do you coach women through those moments that they might be dreading?
I think it would just be to remember that God is at his strongest when we are at our weakest. And we can do things that we don't think that we can do. I've had to deal with 2 weddings. My ex-husband was not present, so I didn't have that specific situation to have to go through. But I know there are situations that are coming up that he will be present. And then his family is, of course, around from time to time. But we just have to keep going back to the fact that we're strong. We have God on our side. We're in charge of our emotions. We're in charge of our thoughts. And we don't have to let someone else dictate how we feel or make us feel any less of a person. We're living our life. They're living their life. They're intermingled. But as long as I'm happy, as long as my children love me, and we have good things going on in our lives, and you still have got a part of it, then we can do a lot more than we give ourselves credit for.
And how do you reconcile? Because some of my friends have said these very words to me, that now that I'm divorced, what did all of that even mean? What did all of that time even mean? Like, yes, I may have children and I'm really thankful for them, But was all of that just a waste, all of those years? How have you maybe come to that in your own mind of looking at your past?
Mm-hmm. Well, number one is I have three incredible children that I would
Mm-hmm.
never had otherwise. So that's just my saving grace. And then I'm about to have
Mm-hmm.
a little house full of grandbabies. So that's going to be
Mm-hmm.
awesome. But that's really kind of, I think, what prompted the writing of God's Got You, because we're not starting over. And I think that's what you're getting at is
Mm-hmm.
we're not, we feel like, okay, well, we wasted all that time. We wasted the best years of our lives. Now we're having to start over. But you're really not starting over. You're just beginning again in the place that God has you now. Because all the wisdom that we've learned, the experience that we have, the lessons that we've been taught, the people that our lives have, crossed with, and just all of the things that have made us who we are today, we're just beginning again in a new place, in a new season. And I think that's the best way to look at it is not, well, thanks a lot, God. I have to start over
Mm-hmm.
now. And I wasted my whole life because you didn't guide me in the right way,
Mm-hmm.
20, 30 years ago is, yeah, but I've learned all these things. I have all these blessings that I've built up over these however many decades, that we're talking about. And now you're equipped to embrace whatever this new beginning has. But we have to have the right perspective and look at it as this is a new season, a new beginning, a new chance, and not just I'm having to start over. And all of that was worthless because nothing we've ever done is worthless because it brought us to where we are today.
Yeah. Amen. Such a great perspective. Well, Tracie, as we close today, what would be kind of your final charge or word of encouragement for women who are finding themselves in this place of divorce?
Well, kind of like we said earlier, just take it one day at a time
Mm-hmm.
and trust that God has you in his hands and he is going to provide. He sees you, your family, and you can get through this. You've got this, he's got you.
Mm-hmm. Did you have mantras or things that you like, just quick things that you would say to yourself that really helped you?
Two things come to mind. One is the one I just said, because that was the name of this book. And initially I had named the book when I pitched it to my publisher was you girl, you've got this. That was
Mm-hmm.
like, that was my official title. But they changed it to God's Got You. And then I've woven in, and you've got this throughout the book. And God just kind of gave me that term one day, like, you've
Mm-hmm.
got this. You can do it. You've done all these other things that you didn't think you could do. You've got this. And the other thing, several years ago, I was sitting, I'll tell real quickly, in a doctor's office. This was very shortly after my ex-husband had left. And I was going for a checkup and I'm checking off all the boxes. And it's like, your name, your gender, your marital status. And I'm like, what is my marital status?
Mm-hmm.
I'm separated, but I'm not divorced, but I'm not married. I'm not widowed. And I kind of had this full blown identity crisis and
Mm-hmm.
just started breaking down in tears sitting there in that waiting room, which obviously caused a scene because I was emotionally unstable anyway. But God just impressed upon my heart. He said, the end of your marriage is not the end of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so it didn't matter what boxes I checked on that form. My marriage may have ended, but Tracie did not end. Tracie's life did not end. All the blessings he was giving me, all the things that had happened and led up to where I was, my life was still going to move forward. And so I would say those are the two things that I've kind of held on to as my mantra over the last few years.
I just love that. It's not the end of you. That's so good. And what a great word to end on. Thanks for being here, Tracie.
Thank you so much.
Bye.